Hello again, and welcome into the Magic the Gathering unofficial audiobooks podcast. Your humble narrator, Phil Dawson here, and wanting to say thank you for telling your friends and sharing the podcast. As if you follow me on Instagram or as our Patreon supporters know, we actually cracked the top 100 games chart last week, which is very cool on Apple Podcasts. Plus, we're still a perfect 5-star rating on Spotify. So please, if you haven't, give us that 5 stars. Tell your friends. Share the podcast, and let's keep seeing this thing grow together. Speaking of growth, I'm totally stunned and amazed that we have gotten supporters 7 and 8 joining as patrons as we welcome Devin and Harley. I thank you so much for choosing to help this project. It really means a lot. Also, the Discord is up and running, and while I'm basically an old man when it comes to what to do with Discord, your fellow listeners are starting to make it really cool. So you can join up to the Discord. It's open to everyone right now. The link is in the show notes. And if you have the funds to support the Patreon, I'd really appreciate it. The link also in the show notes. We're getting so close to the end of Planeswalker, and planning has already started for our next book, schedule-wise. Remember, I'll be taking a little break, but then kicking things off, so please tell your friends. Share the podcast. Let's keep growing. I'm so happy you're here, and truly thank you for the support and listening. So, let's get it going. Chapter 22. There was no laughter 3 days later over the Sea of Laments. The weather had been chancy since Xantcha had put the Argivian coast at her back. From the start, thick clouds had blocked her view of the sun and stars. She navigated against a wind she knew wasn't steady and with an innate sense of direction that grew less reliable as she tired. They hadn't seen land for 2 days, not even a boat. Xantcha would have brought the sphere down on a raft just then and taken her chances with strangers. A black wall cloud had formed, leaking lightning to the northeast. The waves below were stiff with crosswinds and froth. She knew better than to try to soar above the impending storm, didn't have the strength to outrun it, and didn't know what would happen to the sphere if, when, downdrafts slammed it into the ocean. Radapi had his arms around her, keeping Xantcha warm and upright, the most he could do. He'd spotted the storm but hadn't said anything. Other than that, he knew how to swim. Radapi was one up on Xantcha there. The long-ago seaman who taught her how to sail had warned her never to get friendly with the sea. If, when, they went down, she'd yawn out Urza's armor. Maybe it would keep her afloat, though it never had kept her dry. The storm was bigger than the wall cloud, and fickle, too. In a matter of minutes, it spawned smaller clouds, one to the north, the other directly overhead. The first wind was a downdraft that hit the sphere so hard Xantcha and Radapi were weightless, floating, and screaming within it. Then, as Xantcha fought to keep them above the waves, a vagrant wind struck from the south. The south wind pushed them into sheets of noisy, blinding rain. The squall died as suddenly as it had been born. Xantcha could see again, and wished she couldn't. The distance between them and the storm's heart had been halved, and worse, a waterspout had spun out. Rooted in both the ocean and the clouds, the sinuous column of sea water and wind bore down on them as if it had eyes, and they were prey. "What is that?" Radapi whispered. "Waterspout," she told him, and felt his fingers lock into her arms like talons. "Is it going to eat us?" The waterspout wasn't alive and didn't really have an appetite for fools, but that scarcely mattered as they were caught, and spun with such force that the sphere flattened against them. It flattened, but held, even when they slammed into the raging waves. At one point, Xantcha thought they were underwater, if only because everything had become dark and quiet. Then the ocean spat them out, and they hurtled through the wind and rain. Wind, rain, and above all, lightning. Whatever the cyst produced, whether it was Urza's armor or the sphere, it attracted lightning. Bolts struck continuously. The air within the sphere turned acrid and odd. It pulled their hair and clothes away from their bodies and set everything aglow with blue-white light. Xantcha lost all sense of north or south and counted herself lucky that she still knew up from down. Every few moments the storm paused as if regrouping its strength for the next assault. In one such breather, Radapi leaned close to her ear and said, "I love you." She shouted back, "We're not dead yet," and surrendered the sphere to an updraft that carried them into the storm's heart. They rose until the rain became ice and froze around the sphere, making it heavy and driving it down into the sea. Xantcha thought for sure they'd hit the waves, sink, and drown, but the storm wasn't done playing with them. As lightning boiled off the ice, the winds launched them upward again. Xantcha tried to break the cycle, but her efforts were useless. They rose and froze, plummeted and rose again, not once or twice, but 9 times before they fell one last time and found themselves floating on the ocean as the storm passed on to the south. The pitch and roll among the choppy waves was the insult after injury. Radapi's grip on Xantcha's arms weakened, and she suffered nausea. "I can't lift us up," she said, having tried and failed. "I'm going to have to let go of the sphere." "No!" Radapi's plea should have been a shout. It was barely coherent moan instead. "I'll make another. Too sick. Can't float." She tried to ignite his spirit. "A little seasickness won't kill you." "Can't." "Waste not, want not. I'm the one who can't swim. I'm counting on you to keep me afloat until I can make another sphere." Radapi slumped beside her. His face was gray and sweaty. His eyes were closed. Whatever strength he had left was dedicated to fighting the spasms in his gut. A little bit of seasickness would kill them both if she released the sphere. And if she didn't release it? Xantcha tried to make it rise, but lifting the sphere had always been something that simply happened as it formed and not anything she ever consciously controlled. "Urza," Radapi said through clenched teeth. "Urza'll come. Your heart." Urza had come when she'd nearly blown herself up with the Phyrexian ambulator, but now she wasn't in any immediate danger. The sky overhead was a brilliant blue, and the sphere bobbed like a driftwood log. "Sorry, Radapi. If he didn't pull us out of that storm we were riding, then he's not going to pull us out of here. I'm not close enough to dying to get his attention." "Gotta be away." Xantcha peeled Radapi's sweat-soaked hair away from his eyes. He'd said he loved her, in a moment of sheer panic, of course, but there was a chance he'd been telling the truth. Sexless, parentless newt that she was, Xantcha didn't imagine she could love as born folk did, but she felt something for the miserable young man beside her that she'd never felt before, something worth more than all her books and other treasures. "Hold on," she urged, grasping his hand. "I'll think of something." Xantcha couldn't think of anything she hadn't already tried, and the sphere remained mired in the water. The waves had lessened, and she enjoyed the gentle movement, but Radapi was as miserable as when the storm had dropped them. And by the way he was sweating out his misery, he'd be parched before long, too. "Come morning, we'll be late," she said as the sky darkened. "Maybe Urza will come looking for us, but maybe not right away." "Can't you do something to make him look?" Radapi asked. A whole sentence exhausted him. He rested with his eyes closed. Xantcha tried to tell Radapi that the motion would bother him less if he sat up and looked at the horizon, as he'd learned to do when they were soaring. Radapi insisted the motions were totally dissimilar and refused to try. "How does Urza know when you need him?" "He doesn't," Xantcha answered. "When we were dodging Phyrexians, we stayed close, but the rest of the time I never gave much thought to needing Urza, and he certainly never needed me." "Never? 3,000 years? And you never needed each other?" "Never." Radapi sighed and curled around his knees. He began to shiver, a bad sign considering how warm the Sea of Laments was in the summer. Xantcha tucked their blankets around him, then, because she worked up a sweat herself, stripped off her outer tunic. It got tangled in her hair and in the thong of a pendant she'd worn so long she'd forgotten why she wore it. "You can hit me now," she said, breaking the thong. "What?" "I said you can hit me now, or you can wait until after we find out if this thing still works." "What?" "A long time ago, and I mean a long time ago, Urza did make me an artifact that would get his attention. I used something like it just once before Urza invaded Phyrexia. I have to break it." That time, Xantcha had crushed the little crystal between 2 rocks. This time, she tried biting it and broke a tooth before it cracked. Waste not, want not. At least she'd been far-sighted enough to use her back teeth, which grew back quicker than the front ones. That time, Xantcha had crushed the little crystal between 2 rocks. This time, she tried biting it and broke a tooth before it cracked. Waste not, want not. At least she'd been far-sighted enough to use her back teeth, which grew back quicker than the front ones. That time, between the rocks, there'd been a small flash of light as whatever power or sorcery Urza had sealed within the crystal was released. This time, Xantcha neither saw nor felt anything, and when she examined the broken pieces, they were lined with a sooty residue that didn't look promising. How long? Radapi asked. A day before he got there with his dragon. Radapi groaned. Too long. Zancha was inclined to agree. Urza must have come back to the forest before he went after the dragon. He wouldn't have taken the chance that the Phyrexians might get away, and after he'd finished with the diggers, he'd know where the ambulator was. If Urza was going to haul them out of the Sea of Laments, they'd be on dry land before moonrise, if the crystal hadn't lost its power. If Urza recognized its signal and remembered what it meant. Those were worries Zancha kept to herself. The stars came out. Zancha began to fear the worst, at least about Urza and for Radapi. They had enough food and water for 2 more days. Taking advantage of her newt's resilience, Zancha could get to land either way. She wasn't so sure about Radapi. It would be a stupid way for anyone to die, but the same could be said about most deaths. Radapi fell asleep. His breathing steadied, his skin grew warmer and drier. It might be over his seasickness by morning. He had adapted to soaring, and there was nothing to be gained by premature despair. Zancha settled in around him. It was remarkable that 2 bodies could be more comfortable curled around each other than either was alone. She closed her eyes. Zancha woke up with a stabbing pain in her gut, water sloshing against her armpits, and Urza shouting in her ear. What misbegotten scheme put you in the middle of the ocean? He had her by the nape of the neck like a cat carrying a kitten and held Radapi the same way. The sphere was burst, obviously. Zancha knew she should yawn out the armor, but Urza moved too fast. They were a split instant between worlds, a heartbeat longer in the wintry winds of a nearby world, then back through the between worlds to the cottage. Zancha was gasping, mostly because Urza dropped her before turning his attention to Radapi, who turned blue during the 3-stride walk. She knew his color because they'd traveled west and the sun wasn't close to setting behind the Oran Ridge. A bit of healing and a few sips from the green bottle off Urza's shelves brought Radapi around. Change your clothes, brother, Urza commanded in a tone that had surely started battles in their long-ago nursery. Wash! Get something to eat. Zancha and I need to talk. Mishra, of course, stood his ground. Don't blame Zancha, and don't think you can ignore me. Again. I'm the one that wanted to see Koilos. Radapi pronounced the word in the old-fashioned way. Zancha dared a glance at Urza's eyes, thinking her lover was getting advice from the Weakstone. Both of Urza's eyes were glossy black from lid to lid. She hadn't seen them like that since they'd left Phyrexia, which made her think of Gix and the Thran and a score of other things she quickly stifled. Zancha tried to catch Radapi's eye and pass him a warning to tread cautiously if he couldn't figure that out for himself. With his bold remark, Radapi had effectively changed the landscape of recrimination. If Zancha could have seized control of the argument at that moment, she could have guaranteed there'd be no revelations about the fate of the Thran. If she could have seized control, she didn't catch Radapi's eye, and Urza had lost interest in hers as well. Koilos is dead. There's nothing left. We took it all, brother. Us and the Phyrexians, Urza said, leaving Zancha to wonder if he'd visited the cave since his return to Dominaria. I needed to see it with my own eyes, Radapi replied, a comment that, considering the circumstances, could have many layers of meaning. You told me to go away for a while, so I did. I never meant for you to go to Koilos. If it was Koilos you wanted, we could have gone together. That was never a good idea, Urza, Radapi said with the finality as he walked out the open door, following the near orders Urza had already given. You should have stopped him, Urza hissed at Zancha when they were alone. My brother is fragile. Koilos could have torn him apart. It's just another place, Urza, Zancha countered, resisting the urge to add that Radapi was just another man. Neither statement was true. After a year on the Oran Ridge, Radapi might not be Mishra, but he'd become more than a willful one-time slave. Just another place, Urza mocked her. For one like you, yes, I suppose it would be. What would you see? A cave? Some ruins? What did my brother see? He isn't quite himself yet. The next one will be better, stronger. I expected it would take several Mishras before I take one back to Koilos. There won't be another Mishra, Urza. Urza turned away. He puttered at his work table, scraping up residues and dumping them in a bucket. He'd been working on something when the crystals struck his mind. Zancha's anger, always quick to flare, was also quick to fade. Thank you for picking us out of the ocean. I didn't know at first. It took me a moment to remember what it was that I was hearing. I made that crystal for you so long ago when I still thought I could invade and destroy Phyrexia. My ambitions have grown smaller since Equilor. It's all I can do to protect Dominaria from them. I'll make you another. Make it easier to break. I lost a tooth on this one. Make one for Radapi, too. Radapi? Urza looked up, puzzled, then nodded. When this is over, when I've exposed the sleepers and put Phyrexia on notice that Dominaria is prepared to fight them, it will be time to talk about the future. I've thought about it while you were gone. This cottage isn't big enough. I've begun to envision permanent defenses for all Dominaria, for old Terra Sierra, and all of the other great islands. Artifacts on a scale to dwarf any that I've made before. I'll build them in place, and when I've finished one of the new centuries, I'll move on to the next. I'll need assistance, of course, other than me and... Xantcha left her thought dangling. What I've planned will take a generation, maybe 10, before it is complete. And the assistants I have in mind will become the guardians of my centuries. They'll become the patriarchs and matriarchs of permanent communities. You understand that can't include you. As for him, he's mortal, not like you or me. We are what the Phyrexians made us. I can't change that, or him. I wouldn't, even if I could. That would be adding abomination to abomination. But he, Radapi, my brother, will age and die. I hoped you would choose, while you were together these last few days, to remain together with him somewhere else. Yes, it would be best for me, for what I have to do. Urza wasn't mad, not the way he'd been mad and locked in the past for so long. Bringing him face to face with Mishra had set him free to be the man Caleb bin Krug had known. Self-centered, self-confident, and selfish. Blithely convinced, until the world came to an end, that whatever he wanted was best for everyone else too. Xantcha was too weary for anger. We'll talk, she agreed. Maybe she'd tell him what she'd learned at Koilos. More likely, she wouldn't bother. Urza was immune to truth. Do you still need either of us, or should we make ourselves scarce again? She asked. No, not at all. I have work for you, Xantcha. He gestured toward one wall where boxes were piled high. They've all got to be put in place. I'll walk you there, you know. It's quite fortunate in a way that you broke the crystal. I'd forgotten them completely. I'll make up a score by dawn. Think of it. No more waiting. No more wasted time. As soon as you're finished, you can summon me and I'll walk you to the next place. Tomorrow, she said, heading for the door. Xantcha had gotten what she'd wanted. If she'd been born with the true imagination, she would have known that getting what she wanted wouldn't be the same as what she had expected. Tonight I've got to rest. Radapi was waiting for her in the other room. Did you tell him? Xantcha shook her head. She sat down heavily on her stool. The chest with her copies of the Antiquity Wars caught her eye. What would Kayla have said? Urza never really changes. His friends never really learn. There wasn't any need to tell Urza anything. He's got his visions, his future. Nothing I'd tell him would make any difference, just like you said. We're going to be busy until the glimmer moon goes high. I am, at least. He's got a pile of spiders for me to plant and great plans for that crystal I broke. Watch and see. By tomorrow, Urza will have decided that it was his idea for us to get stuck in the Sea of Laments. Radapi stood behind her, rubbing her neck and shoulders. It had taken only a year, after more than 3,000, to become dependent on the touch of living fingers. She'd missed him. I should have stayed? He asked. I hope if I took the blame, if I made Mishra take it, he'd calm down quicker. I guess I was wrong. Not entirely. You had a good idea, and you handled it well. She shrugged off his hands and stood. Has Urza ever told you that he thinks you're the first of many Mishras who are going to walk back into his life? Never in those words, but sometimes I know he's frustrated with me. It scares me sometimes, because if he decided he didn't want me around, there'd be nothing I could do about it. But I've gotten used to not having charge of my own life. I forgot Radapi. I'm just Rat, trying to live another day, and not always sure why, except for you. Xantcha studied her hands, not Radapi's face. Maybe you should think about taking charge of your life again. He's decided it's time for a new Mishra? Do I get to help find my replacement? No. That didn't sound right. I mean, I'm not going to look for another Mishra. She took a deep breath. And I won't be here if another Mishra comes walking over the ridge. Radapi pushed air through his teeth. He's sending us both away because we went to Koilos? She shook her head. Because my plan worked. Urza's not thinking about the past anymore, and you and I were part of his past. I'll go back to effing Pincher, Pincher City. Radapi spoke aloud, but mostly to himself. After we expose the sleepers and all, Tabarna's going to need good men. If Tabarna's not a sleeper himself, if he is, I don't know who'll become king, and we'll need good men even more. What about you? We could work together for effing Pincher. You're smarter than you think you are. You leap sometimes when you should think, and as if part of you is as young as you look, but you know things that never got written down. Xantcha walked to the window. I am part of the past, Radapi, and I am tired. I never realized just how tired. It's been a too long day, and the worst always falls on you. He was behind her again, rubbing her shoulders and guiding her toward the bed. Zancha's weariness wasn't anything that sleep or Radapi's passion could cure, but she wasn't about to discuss the point. Urza walked her to Morvern shortly after dawn. He left her with 2 sacks of improved spiders, explicit instructions for where they should be placed, and a plain-looking crystal he promised wouldn't break her teeth. 4 days later, Zancha took no chances and crushed the crystal between 2 stones. Urza walked her to Bazarat, then to other sleeper-ridden city-states on Gulmany's southern and eastern coasts. There wasn't time, he said, for side trips to the cottage. They had 18 days until the glimmer moon struck its zenith. "What about Effin Pincher?" she asked before he left her a sack of spiders in the hills beyond another southern town. "Will there be time to put the new ones there?" "You and him," Urza complained. "Yes, I've taken care of that myself. When the night comes, that's where you'll be, in the plaza outside the palace in Pincher City. I wouldn't dare suggest any other place. Now, you understand what has to be done here. The spiders in that sack, they're for open spaces for plazas, markets, temple precincts. You've got to put them where they're at least 20 paces all around. Less and the vibrations will start to cancel each other out. And make sure you put them where they won't attract attention or be trampled. You understand? That's important. They mustn't be trampled. They might break, or worse, they'll trigger prematurely." They'd come a long way from screaming spiders. Zancha supposed she'd find out exactly how far in Pincher City. Until then, 20 paces all around, no attention, no big feet. "How long?" 2 days, less if you can. There's some places in the west that we've missed, and it wouldn't hurt to put a few across the Sea of Argavia. "Urza, we've never even looked for Phyrexians there." "It couldn't hurt if there's time." With that, Urza walked away. 17 days later, the eastern city of Narjabul, in which Zancha was planting spiders, had begun to fill with revelers for the coming midsummer festival. Finding the privacy she needed to plant them was becoming more difficult by the hour. At last, a tall, blond-haired man stepped out of the crowd and said, "I think there's nothing more to be done. Let's walk home." The man was Urza, looking like a man in his mid-20s and dressed in a rich merchant's silk that felt as real as they looked. Zancha hadn't expected to see him for another day. She hadn't felt she could break the crystal before then. "I'm nowhere near finished," she confessed. "There aren't enough rooms. The crowds just stay on the streets. It's been difficult, and it's getting worse. They sleep in the plazas where I'm trying to plant the spiders." "No matter," Urza assured her. "One spider more or less won't win the day or the night. There's always next month, next year." He was in one of his benign and generous moods. Zancha found herself instantly suspicious. "Has something gone wrong?" she asked. "With the spiders? At the cottage?" She hesitated to say Radapi's name. No. I thought you and he might want to celebrate. I thought I'd walk you both to Pincher City and leave you there tonight." Urza had his arm draped across Zancha's shoulders and was steering her through the crowd when they were accosted by 3 rowdy youths, considerably worse for the wine and the ale that flowed freely in the guild tents pitched across the plaza. The soberest of the trio complimented Urza's wide-cuffed boots, while one of his companions grabbed Zancha from behind, and the third tried to steal Urza's coin pouch. Zancha stomped her boot heel on her attacker's instep and rammed her elbow against his ribs to free herself. The youth, remarkably sobered by his pain, immediately shouted, "Help! Thief! He's taken my purse and my father's sack! Help! Stop him before he gets away!" Zancha had no intention of running or surrendering the spider-filled sack. She had a fighting knife and could have put a swift end to her attacker, but they'd drawn attention. In the middle of a mob was a dangerous place to make a defensive stand, even with Urza's armor. If she'd been alone, Zancha would have used her sphere and made a spectacular exit. She wasn't alone, though. Urza was a few steps away in the midst of his own fracas, so she yawned out her armor instead and hoped to get them free before too many revelers got hurt. Justice was swift and presumptive. A bystander grabbed her from behind again and put a knife against her throat. He'd probably guessed that something wasn't quite right before she stomped and elbowed him, as she'd done with her first attacker, but everyone knew she was more than she seemed when they saw that the knife hadn't drawn blood. Most folks retreated, making ward signs as they went, but a few rose to the challenge. One of the challengers, a thick-set man in long robes and pounding a silver-banded ebony staff against the cobblestones, was also a sorcerer. "Urza!" Zancha shouted, a name that was apt to get everyone's attention anywhere in Dominaria. It didn't matter what language she used after that to add, "Let's go!" The sorcerer cast a spell, a serpentine rope of crimson fire that fizzled in a sigh of dark, foul-smelling smoke when it touched the armor. He'd readied another when Urza ended the confrontation. Urza had abandoned his merchant's finery for imposing robes that made him seem taller and more massive. He didn't have his staff. It was absolutely real and couldn't be hidden, but Urza the Artificer didn't need a staff. Mana flowed to him easily. Even Xantcha could feel it moving beneath her armored feet, in such abundance that he could afford to target his spells precisely. Small but not fatal lightning jolts for the 3 troublemakers and a mana-leeching miasma for the sorcerer who intervened on the wrong side of a brawl. Then Urza clapped his hand around Xantcha's and walked with her into the Between Worlds. "Between us and the spiders, everyone in Narjabul is going to remember this year's Midsummer Festival." Xantcha laughed when her feet were on solid ground outside the cottage. Urza grimaced. "They'll remember my name. The sleepers and who knows what else might get suspicious before tomorrow night. I didn't want to be connected with this, not yet. I want Phyrexia to know that Dominaria is fighting back, not that Urza has returned to haunt them." "I'm sorry, I had a knife at my throat. There was a sorcerer taking aim at me, and a crowd about to get very unpleasant. I wasn't thinking about consequences." "I never expect you to." Radapi came out of the workroom. They hadn't seen each other for 17 hectic days. But when Xantcha kept her greeting restrained, he caught the warning and did likewise until they were alone in the other room. "Did Urza tell you we're going to watch the spiders from Effin Pincher?" He lifted Xantcha off the floor and spun her around. "He said he was going to leave us there." Radapi set her down. "I told him that you'd given me your word that I could go back to my old life. I called it the life I had before Mishra awoke within me. He started talking about making big artifact centuries, just like you said. He didn't come out and say that he wanted to make room for a new Mishra, too, but I understood that's what he meant." "I keep thinking about the Weak Stone." Radapi shook his head. "If Urza paid attention to the Weak Stone, he'd have an aching head. But he's less attuned to it now than he was when I got here. He's putting the past behind him. I decided to make it easier for myself. If he leaves me in Pincher City, I'm no worse off than I was a year ago. Better, in fact, since I've learned some artifice." Radapi tried to sound optimistic and failed. Xantcha opened the chest where she kept her supply of precious stones and metals. "Wouldn't hurt to be prepared." She handed him a heavy golden chain that could keep a modest man in comfort for life. "He'll change his mind about you, Xantcha. He's never going to send you away," Radapi insisted, but he dropped the chain over his head and tucked it discreetly beneath his tunic. Xantcha hauled out coins as well, and a serviceable knife with a hidden compartment in its sheath. "It's the Festival of Fruits," Radapi protested, refusing to accept the weapon. "There's going to be chaos for sure, and who knows what for us afterward." She took his hand and lightly slapped the knife into it. "What about a sword, then?" he asked, eyeing her rafter-hung collection. "I was wrong to have a sword in Medryn. Effin Pincher doesn't have a warrior cult, and your nobility averted its eyes about 10 years ago. We'll try to be part of the crowd. Knives are common man's weapon." "You're nervous?" Radapi asked with evident disbelief. "Cautious. You and Urza, you're acting as if this is going to be some victory celebration. We don't know what's going to happen, not in a whole lot of ways." "You don't want to go?" "No, I want to see what happens, and Urza's made up his mind. I haven't survived all this time by being careless, that's all." "You're nervous about being with me, about taking care of me because you think I can't take care of myself." Xantcha pulled up her pant leg and buckled an emergency stash of gold around her calf. She didn't answer Radapi's questions. "I know Pincher City," he said petulantly. "It's my home, and I can keep my nose clean if I need to. Ava here's mercy. It's the damn Festival of Fruits, 7 days of berries. All music and bright colors. Parents bring their children." Unimpressed, Xantcha handed him a smaller knife to tuck inside his boot, then closed the chest on her treasures, wondering if she'd ever look at Kayla's picture again.